The gavel, a bird of prey carved from dark, stained wood, hung suspended in the shimmering heat above the auctioneer's grasping hand. Below it, on a makeshift platform of rough-hewn planks, Ilara stood, her calico dress, mended so often it was more patch than pattern, clinging to her thin frame. The dust of the Redemption Town Square, a place that had long forgotten the meaning of its name, coated her worn boots and settled like a shroud on her downcast face. Her mother's debts, a ledger of sorrows penned by Silas Blackwood's greedy hand, had come to this, a public ledger of shame. The sun beat down, a merciless eye in the vast, indifferent sky, and the air thrummed with a mixture of sweat, cheap whiskey, and a predatory anticipation that made Ilara's stomach clench. She could feel the eyes of the crowd, some curious, some leering, a few, she thought with a pang of desperate hope that quickly died, tinged with pity, but none moved to intervene. They were a gallery of ghosts, their courage long since withered under Blackwood's shadow. He stood near the platform, a portly man in a waistcoat too tight, his florid face gleaming with triumph. His voice, when he spoke to the auctioneer, was a wet, proprietary sound. "Show her paces, Hatcher. Let the good folks see the merchandise." Hatcher, a man whose soul seemed as parched as the cracked earth underfoot, forced a jovial tone. "Gentlemen, what we have here is a rare commodity. Young, healthy, strong enough for farm work or lighter duties." A ripple of coarse laughter went through the predominantly male crowd. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of her sobs. Inside, a small, fierce coal of defiance still glowed. Her mother had been a fighter, and that spirit, however battered, lived in her. She focused on the memory of her mother's hand, calloused from work but always gentle, stroking her hair. Sheriff Brody was there, leaning against the wall of the general store, his badge a dull star on his faded vest. His gaze was fixed on the distant mesas, his jaw tight. He looked like a man wrestling with a rattlesnake in his gut, and losing. Blackwood owned this town, body and soul, and the law, it seemed, was just another commodity he'd purchased. "Let's start the bidding at $20. Hatcher chirped, his eyes darting around. "A fine price for such a willing worker. $20. The price of a decent horse." Ilara felt a cold wave wash over her. From the edge of the crowd, a figure detached itself from the deeper shadows of the livery stable. He was tall, his frame lean but broad-shouldered, dust-caked from a long ride. A wide-brimmed hat obscured his face, but there was an stillness about him, a rootedness, that drew a few curious glances. He didn't speak, didn't move further, just watched. His presence was like a sudden drop in temperature, a silent question mark in the otherwise raucous square. Ilara, chancing a desperate glance, saw only the hat, the set of his shoulders. He was just another man, come to gawk. The bidding crawled upwards. 25, from a grizzled trapper whose eyes roamed her with an owner's appraisal. 30, from a saloon owner with greasy hair and a wet-lipped smile. Each bid was a fresh nail in her coffin. Blackwood watched, smug, occasionally nodding to one of his cronies, orchestrating the miserable spectacle. He wanted her humbled, broken, a warning to any others who dared owe him. The stranger at the edge of the crowd remained motionless, but Ilara, in a fleeting moment when his head tilted slightly, caught the briefest glint of his eyes beneath the brim. They weren't leering, or indifferent. They were watchful. And in their depths, she imagined, or perhaps desperately willed it to be so, a flicker of something that looked like anger, cold and hard as iron. He saw not the merchandise Hatcher hawked, but the raw, bleeding edge of an injustice that stank to high heaven. A nerve, long dormant and buried under layers of his own past grief, began to thrum. The bidding had stalled at $45, a sum that would keep Ilara indebted to whichever brute claimed her for years. The man with the greasy hair, a rival saloon keeper named Finnegan, looked confident, his chest puffed out. He winked at Ilara, a gesture that made her skin crawl. Blackwood smirked. Finnegan was one of his creatures, and this outcome suited him well enough. 45, going once. Hatcher called out, his voice grating. Going twice. Ilara braced herself, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the knuckles white. This was it. The end of any hope. Then, a voice cut through the murmuring anticipation, low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a dry riverbed. It wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable authority, silencing the square as effectively as a gunshot. 1,000. The words hung in the stunned air. Hatcher's jaw dropped. Finnegan's smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-mouthed disbelief. Even Blackwood looked momentarily startled, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the crowd, trying to locate the source of this outrageous bid. The stranger stepped forward, just a few paces, enough for the sunlight to catch the hard lines of his face. He was weathered, his skin like old leather, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. He pushed his hat back slightly, revealing a brow furrowed not with anger, but with a deep, unyielding resolve. $1,000, he repeated, his gaze fixed not on Hatcher, but on Blackwood. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $1,000 was a fortune, more than most of them would see in a lifetime of toil. It was an impossible sum for a girl with nothing but the dress she stood in. Blackwood recovered quickly, his face darkening. And who might you be, a friend, with that kind of money to throw around on used goods? The insult was deliberate, meant to provoke, to demean Ilara further. The stranger's expression didn't change. His eyes, cold and steady, met Blackwood's. The name's Jedediah. And the money's real. He reached into his saddlebag, which he'd carried with him, and produced a heavy leather pouch. With a gesture towards Hatcher, he said, "Count it." Hatcher, trembling slightly, fumbled with the pouch, his eyes wide as gold coins spilled onto his small table. The sight of actual gold, not just promises or credit, had a profound effect on the crowd. This was serious. This was power of a different kind. Blackwood's face was a mask of fury. This wasn't part of his plan. He'd intended to make an example, to acquire Ilara cheaply through a proxy, or to break her spirit so thoroughly she'd be pliable. This silent, imposing stranger had just upended his entire scheme. "The girl is damaged goods, stranger," Blackwood spat, trying to regain control. "Her mother was a thief, her father a no-account drifter. You'll find better stock elsewhere." Jedediah's gaze didn't waver. "I ain't buyin' a livestock, Blackwood. I'm settlin' her debt. Hers, it seems, is paid." He looked at Hatcher. "Is it enough?" Hatcher, still counting, nodded dumbly. More than enough, mister." "Then she's free to go." It wasn't a question. Jedediah turned his eyes to Ilara. For the first time, she saw them clearly. They were filled with a profound sadness, but also a steely determination. There was no menace in them, only a strange, unsettling gentleness. He held out a hand, large and calloused. "Come on, girl." Ilara hesitated. Her mind reeled. From the abyss of despair to this sudden, inexplicable deliverance. Who was this man? Why would he do this? But the hand remained, steady and patient. It was a lifeline. She took a deep breath, the first that didn't feel like it was laced with fear, and placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, reassuring. He led her down from the platform. The crowd parted before them, a sea of stunned, whispering faces. Blackwood's voice, raw with fury, lashed out. "This ain't over, stranger. You'll regret crossing me." Jedediah didn't look back. He didn't quicken his pace. He simply walked, Ilara beside him, towards the livery stable where his horse, a lean, tough-looking buckskin, was tied. Sheriff Brody pushed himself off the wall, his expression unreadable, a flicker of something new, respect, in his eyes as he watched them go. The silence Jedediah left in his wake was heavier, more profound, than any noise the square had held all day. They rode out of redemption as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. Jedediah had procured a sturdy mare for Ilara from the livery, paying with another coin that made the stable master's eyes widen. He hadn't spoken more than a few necessary words to her since leaving the square. "Can you ride?" he'd asked. She'd nodded, her throat too tight for words. He'd helped her mount, his touch impersonal but not unkind. Now, they moved through the arid landscape, the silence between them broken only by the rhythmic clopping of hooves and the sigh of the wind through the sagebrush. Ilara rode slightly behind him, her gaze fixed on his broad, unyielding back. He rode with an easy confidence, his body moving with the horse as if they were one. Who was this man, this silent savior who had appeared from nowhere and plucked her from the depths of her despair? His silence was a wall, unbreachable, yet in it, she found not menace, but a strange sort of peace. It was a silence that demanded nothing, expected nothing. After the cacophony of the auction, the lewd remarks, Blackwood's venomous pronouncements, Jedediah's quietude was a balm. As dusk deepened into night, they made camp in a shallow draw, sheltered by a small rock outcropping. Jedediah moved with an economy of motion, unsaddling the horses, gathering firewood, starting a small, smokeless fire. He offered her a canteen of water and a piece of jerky from his thil bag. "Eat," he said, his voice still rough, as if words were stones he had to unearth. She ate, slowly, the jerky tough but welcome. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her belly, but it was overlaid now with a fragile curiosity, a nascent trust. She watched him as he stared into the flames, his face harsh in the flickering light, his eyes distant. For a moment, his expression softened, a flicker of profound sorrow passing across his features like a cloud over the moon. He saw not the flames, but other fires, other nights. A woman's laughter, echoing in a small cabin. The feel of a child's small hand clutching his finger, trusting, absolute. Faces lost to a fever that had swept through their valley years ago, a loss so profound it had scoured him raw, leaving him hollowed out, a ghost haunting his own life. He hadn't been able to save them. The helplessness of it still clawed at him in the quiet hours. Seeing Ilara on that platform, the vultures circling, had stirred something in that desolate landscape of his soul, a fierce, protective urge, an echo of the husband and father he had once been. It wasn't a conscious decision to save her, it was an instinct, a reflex, as if his very bones remembered the duty to shield the vulnerable. Perhaps, in saving her, he was trying to quiet the ghosts that whispered of his failure. Ilara, sensing his deep abstraction, hesitated before speaking. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. For what you did." Jedediah turned his head slowly, his eyes returning from that distant place. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for a long moment. He saw the lingering fear in her eyes, the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the resilience that held her upright despite everything. He simply nodded, a curt, almost imperceptible movement, then turned back to the fire. But Ilara thought she saw, in that brief glance, a flicker of something akin to understanding. Later, he unrolled a bedroll for her near the fire. "Sleep," he said. "We ride early." He himself sat propped against his saddle, his hat tilted low, a sentinel in the vast, uncaring wilderness. Ilara lay down, pulling the rough blanket around her. She was exhausted, but sleep was elusive. Every sound in the darkness made her jump. Yet, strangely, the presence of this silent, enigmatic man nearby was a comfort. He was a mystery, his motives unknown, but he had shown her kindness when the world had offered only cruelty. As she drifted into an uneasy slumber, she noticed him subtly checking the perimeter of their small camp, his eye scanning the darkness, his hand never far from the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He'd seen the faint dust cloud on the horizon as they'd left Redemption, too uniform for a natural occurrence. He'd noted the way Blackwood's cronies had watched them depart, their eyes glittering with malice. Blackwood wasn't the type to let such a public humiliation go unanswered. The debt might be paid in gold, but the debt of pride, Blackwood would seek to collect in blood. They rode for 2 more days, pushing steadily westward, deeper into the rugged, unpopulated territory. Jedediah set a relentless pace, but he was mindful of Ilara, ensuring she had water and rest. The silence between them remained, but it was less a wall and more a shared space, a quiet understanding forged in shared hardship and unspoken gratitude. Ilara found herself observing him, the way he read the land, the subtle shifts in his posture that indicated alertness, the way his calloused hands were surprisingly gentle when tending to the horses. She saw the deep lines etched around his eyes, lines of sorrow and hardship, but also of an unyielding strength. He was a man who had known suffering, intimately. On the 3rd day, they reached a small, hidden valley, a slash of green amidst the ochre and grey of the Badlands. A clear stream gurgled through it, and nestled beside it was a small, well-kept cabin with a wisp of smoke curling from its stone chimney. An older woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles that spoke of a life lived fully, stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes, bright and intelligent, took in Jedediah and then Elara, a knowing softness in her gaze. "Jedediah," she said, her voice warm. "Been a while. And who's this you brought?" "Martha," Jedediah nodded, a rare hint of warmth in his own tone. "This is Elara. She needs a safe place." For a spell, Martha's gaze on Elara was kind, without pity but full of empathy. "Well, any friend of Jedediah's is welcome here. Come in, child. You look like you could use a hot meal and a soft bed." Inside Martha's cabin, a haven of warmth and the scent of baking bread, Elara felt a measure of safety she hadn't known in weeks, perhaps years. Martha fussed over her, providing a basin of warm water, a clean dress, old but sturdy, and a bowl of thick, nourishing stew. While Elara ate, her weariness settling deep into her bones, she could hear the low murmur of voices from the porch, Jedediah and Martha. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone of Jedediah's voice was different, softer, as he spoke with the older woman. Later, after Elara had bathed and changed, feeling almost human again, Martha sat with her by the fire. "Jedediah's a good man, child," she said softly, her fingers busy with some mending. "Quiet as a tombstone, most times, but his heart's in the right place." She paused, then added, her voice dropping lower, "He lost his own, you know. His wife, Sarah, and their little girl, Lily. Fever, it was. Took them both within a week. Near destroyed him. He wanders mostly, now. Like he's looking for something he can't find." Elara's heart ached for him. The mystery of his actions began to clear. He hadn't just seen a girl in distress, he'd seen a ghost of his own lost hope, a chance to intervene where fate had once rendered him helpless. The next morning, Jedediah found Elara by the stream. He looked out over the valley, then back at her. "You can stay here with Martha, if you like. She's good folk. You'd be safe." Elara met his gaze, her own clearer now, stronger. "Why did you do it, Jedediah? That much money, for me." He was silent for a long moment, watching the water flow over the smooth stones. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost to himself. "Saw a debt that needed paying. Not yours." He turned to her. "No one should own another soul, Elara. Not ever." His eyes held a flicker of that deep pain Martha had spoken of. Some things a man just has to do." Just then, a rider appeared at the mouth of the valley, silhouetted against the morning sun. Then another, and another. 3 men, hard-faced and heavily armed. Leading them was a man Elara recognized with a jolt of fear, Caleb Hines, Blackwood's brutal foreman. They'd been tracked. Hines spurred his horse forward, a cruel smirk on his face. Well. Look what we found. Blackwood sends his regards, Drifter. And he wants his property back." Before Jedediah could move, another rider appeared, coming fast down the trail behind Hines' men. Sheriff Brody, his face grim, his shotgun held ready across his saddle. "Hold it right there, Hines." Brody's voice boomed, no longer hesitant, but filled with cold authority. "This ain't Blackwood's jurisdiction. And that girl ain't properties." Hines sneered. "Since when did you grow a spine, Sheriff?" Brody's eyes narrowed. "Since men like your boss decided the law was something to be bought and sold." "He's gone too far, Hines." "This ends now." The air crackled with tension, the quiet valley suddenly a stage for a deadly confrontation. Hines and his 2 men exchanged uneasy glances. Sheriff Brody was unexpected, and his newfound resolve was unnerving. Jedediah hadn't moved, but his body was coiled, his hand resting loosely near his hip. His eyes, cold as a winter river, were fixed on Hines. "She's not going anywhere with you," Jedediah stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet carrying the weight of an ironclad promise. "Blackwood made a mistake." Hines spat on the ground. "Blackwood don't make mistakes. And he don't like being made a fool of. He wants the girl, and he wants a piece of you, Drifter, for your trouble." He gestured to his men. Take them. The two thugs started to spread out, hands reaching for their guns. Martha had appeared on the porch, a stoic figure, her old rifle held steady. Elara, though terrified, found herself standing taller, her earlier fear replaced by a surge of anger at the injustice, and a fierce desire to protect the small sanctuary she had briefly known. This was her fight too, now. Jedediah moved then, not with flashy speed, but with a lethal economy that spoke of countless life-or-death struggles. Before Hines' men could clear leather, Jedediah's Colt was out, barking once, twice. Not to kill, but to disarm. One thug cried out, his gun spinning from a numbed hand. The other froze, his eyes wide as Jedediah's barrel swung towards him. "Don't," Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. Sheriff Brody had his shotgun leveled at Hines. "Drop your weapon, Hines." Now Hines hesitated, his face contorted with rage and surprise. He'd expected a cowering girl and a lone, easily overcome stranger, not a determined lawman and a man who moved like a seasoned gunfighter. He saw the cold certainty in Jedediah's eyes, the unwavering aim of Brody's shotgun. Slowly, his hand moved away from his gun. "This ain't the end of it," he snarled. "Blackwood will hear about this, Brody." "He'll have your badge maybe," Brody said calmly. "But today, the law stands for something more than Silas Blackwood's greed." He gestured with his shotgun. "Get off your horses." Eased as Hines' men were disarmed and their hands secured by Brody, a larger cloud of dust appeared at the valley entrance. Silas Blackwood himself rode into view, his face purple with rage, flanked by another half-dozen of his hard cases. He'd clearly been following his first party, anticipating trouble or ensuring his orders were carried out. His eyes, like chips of obsidian, fixed on Jedediah, then on Elara. "So, the knight-errant and his rescued damsel," Blackwood sneered, his voice dripping venom. "And Brody, playing the hero. How touching." He looked at Jedediah. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, stranger. That money you paid? Consider it a down payment on the pain you're about to experience." Jedediah didn't flinch. He simply stood, a bulwark between Blackwood and Elara. The deep sorrow that usually shadowed his features was replaced by a cold, righteous fury. This was the moment his past had prepared him for, not to avenge his own loss, but to prevent another's. He remembered the helplessness as he'd watched his wife and daughter fade, the doctors shrugging, the prayers unanswered. He couldn't fight disease, but he could fight this. He could fight Blackwood. "She ain't property, Blackwood," Jedediah said, his voice carrying clearly across the small clearing. "Never was. You tried to break her, to own her spirit. You failed." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Spirit? I own this town, I own the people in it. And I would have owned her." He drew his own pistol, a fancy, silver-inlaid weapon. "But now, I'll just settle for putting you in the ground." Before Blackwood could aim, Elara, acting on pure instinct, grabbed a heavy iron skillet Martha had left by the outdoor hearth and threw it with all her might. It clanged loudly against the side of Blackwood's horse, making the animal rear and sidestep in fright. The distraction was all Jedediah needed. He lunged, not for his gun, but for Blackwood himself, tackling him from his horse. They crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. Jedediah was relentless, his grief and rage fueling a strength Blackwood couldn't match. He disarmed the larger man with brutal efficiency, then hauled him to his feet, Blackwood's finery covered in dust, his arrogance shattered. Jedediah's face was inches from Blackwood's. "This is for every soul you've tried to crush, Blackwood. For every debt you've twisted into a chain." He didn't strike him again. Instead, he shoved him towards Sheriff Brody. "He's yours, Sheriff." Brody, with a grim satisfaction, clapped irons on Blackwood's wrists. The remaining thugs, seeing their leader captured and their comrades disarmed, lost their bluster, surrendering without further resistance. The confrontation was over. Justice, rough and hard one, had prevailed. In the quiet aftermath, Jedediah turned to Elara. The storm in his eyes had passed, leaving behind a weary calm. He saw the strength in her, the resilience that had not been broken. He had helped her find her footing, but she had stood her ground. He reached into his pouch and took out the remaining gold coins, the bulk of the $1,000. He pressed them into her hand. "This is yours. A new start." Far from here, Ilara looked at the gold, then at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I can't thank you enough, Jedediah. "No thanks needed," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You're free, Ilara." "That's payment enough." He mounted his buckskin. Martha stood on her porch, a small smile on her lips. Sheriff Brody was securing his prisoners, a new authority in his bearing. Jedediah looked back at Ilara one last time. A flicker of something, perhaps peace, perhaps the easing of an old ache, touched his weathered face. He had faced down his own ghosts by saving her from hers. He nodded once, a gesture of farewell, and then, without a word, rode out of the valley, a solitary figure disappearing back into the vast, indifferent landscape. But the land didn't seem quite so empty anymore, for either of them. Ilara watched him go, the gold heavy in her hand, the promise of a future stretching before her, a future bought not with coin, but with courage, his and her own. What would you have done in Jedediah's place? When faced with such cruelty, do we turn away, or do we find the courage to act? Tell me in the comments.